Russia is once again being accused of trying to influence the U.S. presidential election.
The Washington Post is citing unnamed U.S. intelligence officials and congressional staffers who say that intelligence and law enforcement agencies are looking into, quote, what they see as a broad covert Russian operation in the United States to sow public distrust in the upcoming presidential election and in U.S. political institutions, end quote. The Post then elevates the story to the level of the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, by saying that he is looking into, quote-unquote, Russia's covert influence operations. Without clarifying what they mean by influence operations, the Post goes on to write about potential hacking of election systems, with a caveat. Even though the Post admits there is no evidence that Russia has or plans to tamper with the U.S. election process, it propels the fear that Russia may potentially do so. And with that, prompting the question, who's really sowing public distrust in the upcoming presidential election?
We're going to have enough problems in the cyberspace with non-state actors who are engaging in theft and using the internet for all kinds of illicit practices and protecting our critical infrastructure and making sure that our financial systems are sound. And what we cannot do is have a situation in which suddenly this becomes the wild, wild west.
Tensions were high at the G20 summit after President Obama was disrespected by several of the world's top leaders. Is this now a sign that the international community doesn't see President Obama as a respected leader of the most powerful nation on earth? And if that is the case, what does it mean for all of us?
What we are learning from the Pentagon is this happened on Sunday. Word just coming now. A U.S. patrol craft, the USS Firebolt, was in the Persian Gulf when it was essentially swarmed, if you will, by 7 Iranian Revolutionary Guard small boats. But one of those boats came within 100 yards right in front of the U.S. Navy ship and came to a dead stop in the water, significantly raising the risk of a collision between the U.S. Navy ship and the Iranians. The U.S. Navy had to make a sharp turn, steer out of the way, and it came within 100 yards of this Iranian ship that just stopped dead in the water right in front of it. There have been a series of these incidents. They are raising a good deal of concern at the Pentagon. Just consider the numbers, the increased incidents. So far this year, in 2016, 31 unsafe encounters with the Iranians in those waters. All of last year, 23. So the Iranians, in the view of the U.S. Navy, stepping up their unsafe actions in these waters, and there is a good deal of concern that this could lead to a potentially deadly encounter, something the U.S. says it wants to do everything to avoid.
Navy's newest big moves revealing major trouble for ships based out of San Diego and Coronado. And 10 News military reporter Hannah Mullins is live in the newsroom. And Hannah, so the commander of Naval Surface Forces orders a stand down for crews on all littoral combat ships. What's going on?
Well, he did. This is the release. It says they're going to retrain every sailor involved in engineering on those ships. Problems have been plaguing littoral combat ships. It started in December. The USS Milwaukee had just been commissioned. It was headed to its home port in San Diego when engine trouble sidelined it. The next month, the USS Fort Worth was in Southeast Asia. Something damaged the engine's gearing system. It's headed back to San Diego for repairs. Then in July, a seawater leak triggered an engine failure in the USS Freedom. The crippled ship worked its way back into Naval Base San Diego. I found out the USS Coronado, which is also homeported here, was supposed to replace the Fort Worth. But last week, an engine failure left it limping back to Pearl Harbor. The new class of warships is supposed to be smaller, faster, and smarter. But in a matter of months, 4 of 6 LCSs in service have fallen short. The training and testing should be completed in 30 days.
Barack Obama likes to call himself America's first Pacific president, and by all accounts wants to be remembered that way.
The United States is more deeply engaged across the Asia Pacific than we have been in decades.
But Washington got more than it bargained for with newly elected Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte and his bloody anti-drug campaign.
Nobody has the right to lecture on me. God, do not do it.
The U.S. canceled a planned meeting between the leaders, leaving aides to explain.
He regrets that his remarks to the press have caused much controversy.
The nature of our alliance with the Philippines has been and remains rock solid.
It needs to be. Manila is a linchpin in Obama's Asia pivot strategy with a coastline on the South China Sea. After a long absence, U.S. troops will be reopening 5 military bases there. The U.S. is also sending tens of millions of dollars in maritime security aid to Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. 3 of these countries have ongoing territorial disputes with China in these waters.
Anjem Choudhury became infamous in the United Kingdom for praising those behind the 9/11 attacks in the United States and saying he wanted to convert Buckingham Palace into a mosque. In the mid-80s, he formed a group calling for Sharia law in the UK. Over the years, he took his views to the streets.
Therefore, we call upon Muslims around the world to burn the man-made law, to burn the Constitution, to burn the American flag.
Counter-terrorism police have spent almost 20 years trying to bring Choudhury to trial, blaming him for radicalising young men and women. But using his legal background as a solicitor, he managed to stay just inside the law and avoid prosecution until earlier this year when he was convicted of inviting support for Daesh. Police say he urged others to back Daesh through a series of talks on YouTube. The court heard a string of his followers left the UK to fight in Syria and that he can be linked to dozens of terror suspects. For almost 2 decades, Anjem Choudhury radicalised others while carefully avoiding incriminating himself. There are now calls to overhaul terror laws in the UK so future hate preachers cannot hide behind the cloak of free speech and similarly spend so long escaping conviction.
A group of demonstrators brought London's City Airport to a standstill for nearly 6 hours early Tuesday, holding up thousands of passengers. 9 activists of Black Lives Matter UK stormed the runway before dawn and tied themselves to a tripod. They were arrested after more than 5 hours of negotiations with the police. Soon after, the airport announced that the runway had been reopened. The group targeted the airport to protest against climate change, which they said has a disproportionate impact on black people. A demonstration by the group last month closed a road leading to London's Heathrow Airport.
Black Lives Matter has been grown out of street protests and social media hashtags for the last 2 years and are now setting up a legal partnership with the California charity, indicating the movement's growth and ambition. The new budding partnership between the National Black Lives Matter Network and the International Development Exchange shows a side of the loosely knit group that could silence critics who pan the organization for its demonstration methods against an epidemic of police shootings of unarmed black men.
The French government's failure to address the refugee crisis is causing increasing violence and misery across the country. In Paris, the city government finally announced plans for its very first refugee center, but it will house just 400 people for around a week at a time. In this North Paris neighborhood, refugees line the streets for nearly half a kilometer. France is heavily implicated in causing and prolonging many of the world's refugee crises, and so many are represented here: Syrians, Malians, Afghans, Somalians, and others.
Although France has been less affected by the migrant crisis than neighbouring Germany, the numbers are growing. Many migrants come to France hoping to find a way to reach Britain.
Now, one of Britain's most advanced warships will arrive off the Libyan coast in the next few days in a dramatic attempt to intercept and arrest people smugglers. It's part of a Europe-wide strategy to stem a record number of refugees attempting to cross the Mediterranean into Italy.
Italian police say they've smashed a criminal network that smuggled hundreds of mostly Syrian refugees across the Balkans to Western Europe. Up to 21 people have been arrested. The suspects, mainly Syrians, but also Algerians, Egyptians, Tunisians and Lebanese nationals, lived for the most part around Como in northern Italy. But arrests are reported in several European countries in an international operation. With surveillance of suspects put in place authorities, the ring allegedly charged at least €500 per refugee and had a fleet of cars at its disposal, recruiting drivers in Italy. The probe is said to have begun a year ago after an Italian was arrested in Hungary driving a vehicle with several illegal migrants. Migrants and refugees have flooded into Europe over the past 3 years from the Middle East, Africa and Asia.
In Saudi Arabia, hundreds of thousands of worshippers have arrived in Mecca for the annual Hajj pilgrimage, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, which starts on Saturday. This year, authorities have ramped up security, including by giving pilgrims electronic bracelets to prevent a repeat of last year's devastating stampede. The disaster has fueled tensions with Iran. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei accused the Saudis of murder, to which the kingdom's top cleric replied Iranians were not real Muslims. Last year's stampede killed at least 2,400 people. Tehran says more than 400 were Iranian and blamed the huge toll on mismanagement of the pilgrimage. This year, no Iranians will attend the event, and Khamenei has called on Muslim countries to consider ending Saudi control of the holy sites.
The city of Quneitra in southwestern Syria. There are daily fights in this ancient way station on the way to Damascus. We are on the Golan Heights on the Israeli side of the border. For several years, the Syrian civil war has overflowed regularly into Israel. Artillery fire, mortar shellings often land here. The Israeli forces are massively deployed in the area and retaliate each time. These men are part of a combat unit deployed in this sensitive zone. They are members of the Golani Brigade, an elite battalion in charge of the defense of the border.
We have to watch out and see what they do. If anything comes to us, then we take care of it. But other than that, we don't intervene with them.
Now we are arriving in southern Golan. It's a bit tense here.
Their camp is in the area known as the Three Borders, the borders of Israel, Jordan, and of course Syria. The latter now in the hands of several armed groups opposed to the Syrian government forces.
We watch them training all the time just behind the security fence. We know who they are. We are ready for them. There, just a little north, you have a camp of the Yarmouk Martyrs Brigade. They have pledged allegiance to Daesh.
Indeed, as we can see in this propaganda footage filmed on the Syrian side, the Yarmouk martyrs are well established here. They control some parts of the border and often engage their enemy. Recent months, security experts have been more and more concerned about the quick proliferation of diverse militias here.
It's not just one small group. We now count on the Golan Heights at least 60 different groups. Some United Nations observers revealed that they had seen some jihadist training camps with fighters as young as 15. And we are now monitoring the presence of the Hezbollah, backed by Iran, in the scope of our borders.
Who knows whether this vast area, located a few dozen kilometers away from Damascus, could become the next battleground.
Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has said his meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Moscow would not go on as planned. He made the remarks at a press conference in Warsaw after meeting with Polish President Andrzej Duda. Abbas said that Israel asked to delay the September the 9th meeting until an unspecified later date. The meeting had been proposed by Russian President Vladimir Putin, and earlier Abbas conditioned that Israel had to implement its commitments toward the Palestinians in order to hold a meeting with Netanyahu to discuss permanent status question.
Chicago is suffering through its bloodiest summer in decades. Over the weekend, 65 people were shot, 13 killed. Today, the police superintendent said he's doing all he can to fight gang violence, but he said it's not a police issue, it's a society issue.
The 65 people shot in Chicago over the Labor Day holiday weekend included a woman 9 months pregnant shot in the abdomen, a pastor shot in the face, an 80-year-old man shot in the head, as well as several teenagers.
White shirt,
A weekend so bloody it surpassed earlier holiday carnage on Memorial Day and the 4th of July. The victims were found on sidewalks, in driveways, on street corners, and in city parks. Pat, she didn't want to give her last name, was an eyewitness.
I just basically saw a guy drive up in a nice car and jumped out, started shooting towards the park, and once he finished, he took off.
In other parts of town, a victim was murdered as he was driving, another as he walked his dog.
I'm frustrated. The city should be frustrated. And frustrated that the people who commit these crimes just don't care who their actions affect.
Chicago Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson said there was a surge in violence from Sunday to this morning because of youthful gang reprisals for petty insults or juvenile arguments. Most offenders this year have been between 15 and 24 years old. Johnson said his officers need help.
We need the people in the community to do the right thing, because as long as they stay silent, then the people committing these acts feel empowered to continue doing it.
A game popular years ago is making a comeback. Even if you haven't heard of it, chances are your kids have.
And after the death of a little boy who played it, there's a renewed warning for parents.
While these New York City teens shoot some hoops at a park, they know some kids their age are sitting in front of a computer, playing a different kind of game that could kill them.
You faint and then pass out and then you wake up.
Why are people doing this?
Because it's all over social media.
It's called the choking game, also known as the pass out or blackout challenge. It's been around for years, but it's making a comeback because of the horrible how-to videos on sites like YouTube. Dr. Robert Glatter of Lenox Hill Hospital says some kids do it to get a natural high.
You're talking about cutting off blood flow to the brain, which deprives the brain of oxygen.
It's really dangerous because somebody can probably die from that.
11-year-old Garrett Pope died doing it a few days ago in South Carolina. His father took to social media in his time of mourning to let the world know his son's senseless death was not intentional. He took this terrible game too far.
The World Health Organization is recommending safer sex for anyone who has traveled to regions affected by the Zika virus. And a new study suggests Zika can be transmitted through infected tears, possibly causing permanent blindness.
A new study also published on Tuesday suggests it may be possible to spread the virus through tears. According to researchers of Washington University School of Medicine, the virus can live in the eyes and could even cause permanent loss of vision. Zika is believed to cause brain defects in infants.
New research suggests that people's brains are being contaminated by tiny, potentially toxic particles of air pollution. The particles are made of iron oxide and are magnetic. The published reports suggest they could be linked to diseases like Alzheimer's. It's estimated that air pollution kills 6.5 million people a year.
Warning, you are near a toxic spray zone.
Gas masks and poison signs, an ominous warning as you drive through Mount Hope. Crews still spraying the area for mosquitoes.
Yeah, some residents just aren't too happy about this. Earlier, county workers were walking along the sidewalk here, going from house to house and spraying it. But for example, this house, they didn't want to get sprayed, so they printed out a sign like this one here saying, "Do not spray." Now, in this video, you can see this resident yelling at county workers as they entered her property and began spraying it. She, along with other residents, protested as the workers entered the Mount Hope area this morning. The county is spraying 2 blocks near Market and Quail Street after someone tested positive for Zika after returning from a trip. Officials say the person has fully recovered, but they are treating the area in case that person was bitten by a mosquito while they were infected in San Diego. This man says there has to be a safer way than spraying the whole neighborhood.
With such a small radius that they're spraying in, to go around and talk to the people in the neighborhood and say, hey, here's a potential breeding ground. This is what you can do about this. Here's what you can do about this. Instead of potentially putting people at risk with a chemical that we don't know what the side effects are or how it's going to affect our pets.
The Standing Rock Sioux have won a small victory in their battle to keep an oil pipeline from being constructed across their land. A federal judge persuaded the company building the pipeline, Dakota Access, to temporarily halt construction at some of the sites the tribe considers sacred. The agreement follows a weekend of violent protest, and it was a disappointment, according to tribal attorney Jan Hasselman.
We provided evidence on Friday of
sacred sites that were directly in the pipeline's route. By Saturday morning, those sites had been destroyed. And we saw things happening out at Standing Rock, dogs being put on protesters that haven't been seen in America in 40, 50 years.
The demonstrators who were targeted ranged from children to the elderly, according to protester Thomas Alejo.
Children being bit, women, young men, even elders that were out there were trying to stop the construction happening.
At the hearing, Dakota Access denied destroying any sacred sites and accused the demonstrators of attacking both the dogs and the security officers with makeshift weapons. Both sides are now waiting until Friday, when the judge will rule on the tribe's request for a temporary injunction on the construction.